Hello and welcome to the Sleepyhead Geographer. Tonight we're going to visit some of the world's most arid and seemingly lifeless deserts, but we won't be seeing them as they are today. Instead, we'll be traveling back through the mists of time to witness these same landscapes when they were verdant, green, and teeming with life. If this gentle journey helps you rest, consider a quiet like or subscribe so others can find their way here too. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, the vast Sahara Desert. You might picture endless dunes of golden sand, the occasional oasis, and a sun so intense it seems to bleach the very air. But what if I told you that just a few thousand years ago, a mere blink of an eye in geological terms, this same desert was a lush savanna, dotted with lakes the size of small seas, crossed by mighty rivers, and home to hippos, crocodiles, and early human civilizations? Tonight, we'll wander through these transformed landscapes together, letting our minds drift across continents and millennia. We'll visit the Arabian Peninsula when it was crossed by flowing rivers, explore Australia's heart when it was clothed in forests, and walk through what is now the Gobi Desert when it was a subtropical paradise filled with the calls of ancient birds and the rustle of broad-leaved trees. These stories aren't just tales of environmental change. They're reminders of our planet's incredible capacity for transformation. They speak to the dynamic nature of Earth itself, always changing, always becoming something new, following rhythms and cycles that span thousands and millions of years. As we journey together through these green ghosts of desert lands, let the gentle rhythm of our exploration carry you toward peaceful rest, knowing that even in the most barren places, life once flourished abundantly. Our path tonight will take us on a gentle progression through time and space. We'll begin in the not-so-distant past, with the Sahara's green period, then travel eastward to Arabia's ancient rivers, before journeying to Australia's transformed interior. From there, we'll visit Asia's great deserts in their verdant youth, cross to the Americas to witness the transformation of the Great Basin and the Atacama, and finally explore the grand cycles that drive these changes and the human witnesses who observed them unfold. So let's begin our slow, meandering journey through time and space, visiting these desert lands in their green glory days, and allowing their ancient stories to wash over us like a gentle tide, carrying us toward the shores of sleep. We begin our journey in what is perhaps the most famous desert in the world, the Sahara. Today, it stretches across North Africa like a vast sea of sand and stone, covering an area nearly as large as the entire United States. But let's step back in time, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, to a period scientists call the African Humid Period, when the Sahara was anything but the desert we know today. Picture yourself standing on what would today be barren sand dunes in southern Algeria. But in this ancient time, you're standing beside the shore of a lake so vast it rivals Lake Superior. This was Lake Mega Chad, which at its largest extent covered an area of over 150,000 square miles. The water is clear and blue, lapping gently at reed-lined shores. Hippos surface in the deeper waters, their eyes and nostrils barely breaking the surface tension, while crocodiles bask on muddy banks in the warm afternoon sun. The air is humid and sweet, carrying the scent of flowering acacias and the rich, loamy smell of fertile soil. Where today you might see only scattered rocks and endless sand, here you witness rolling grasslands dotted with baobab trees, their massive trunks storing water for the dry season that, in this time, is brief and mild. Herds of antelope move across the savanna in long, flowing lines, their hoofbeats muffled by thick grass. Giraffes browse among tall acacia trees, and elephants move like grey ghosts through woodland clearings. The sky above is often touched with clouds, not the harsh, empty blue dome of today's Sahara, but a sky that promises and delivers regular rainfall. The monsoons reach far into what we now call the desert, bringing life-giving water hundreds of miles further north than they do today. Rivers that are now dry wadis, or exist only as underground water traces, flowed year-round with clear, sweet water. Along these ancient rivers, early human settlements flourished. Archaeological evidence shows us that people lived here in relative abundance, fishing in the rivers and lakes, hunting the plentiful game, and beginning to domesticate cattle. They left behind cave paintings that still exist today, images of swimmers in what are now some of the driest places on Earth, pictures of cattle and wild animals, scenes of daily life in a green land. One of the most remarkable of these ancient rivers was a predecessor to what we now know as the Nile. But it was not alone. There were rivers flowing west into the Atlantic, rivers that curved north toward the Mediterranean, and rivers that fed the great interior lakes. The sound of flowing water was as common in this ancient Sahara as the whisper of wind through sand dunes is today. The vegetation was not just grassland, but a complex mosaic of different habitats. There were gallery forests along the rivers, dense corridors of green where trees grew tall and vines hung like curtains between the branches. Fig trees offered fruit to both animals and humans, while date palms swayed in breezes that carried the sound of bird songs and the splash of fish jumping in the rivers. In the slightly drier areas, away from the rivers but still benefiting from regular rainfall, open woodlands dominated. Here, scattered trees provided shade for grazing animals, and the understory was rich with shrubs and seasonal wildflowers. During the rainy season, these areas would have bloomed with a spectacular display of colors, yellows, reds, and purples carpeting the ground between the trees. This green Sahara supported not just abundant wildlife, but sophisticated human cultures. These were not nomadic desert peoples struggling to survive in harsh conditions, but settled communities living in relative plenty. They developed pottery, created art, and built complex societies. Some groups became skilled fishermen, developing techniques for catching fish in the abundant lakes and rivers. Others became accomplished herders, managing large herds of cattle in the extensive grasslands. The fishing communities along Lake Mega Chad developed elaborate techniques for harvesting the lake's bounty. They created boats from bundled reeds, wove nets from plant fibers, and constructed fish traps that could be left in the shallows while they tended to other tasks. The fish were abundant and diverse. Ancient relatives of modern Nile perch, catfish, and smaller species that swarmed in the clear waters during spawning seasons. Archaeological sites from this period reveal sophisticated settlements with permanent structures, evidence of long-distance trade, and complex burial practices that suggest well-developed spiritual beliefs. These weren't temporary camps of nomadic peoples, but established communities that expected to remain in place for generations. Granaries stored surplus food, workshops produced specialized tools, and gathering places suggest complex social hierarchies and community decision-making processes. The transition from this green paradise to the desert we know today didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded over several thousand years, driven by changes in Earth's orbital patterns that affected the strength and reach of the African monsoons. Slowly, the rains began to fail more often and for longer periods. The Great Lakes began to shrink, their shores receding year by year. Rivers that had flowed perennially began to run dry for months at a time, then only seasonally, then not at all. As the water sources became less reliable, both human and animal populations began to concentrate around the remaining lakes and rivers. This led to overuse of these critical resources, Too many animals grazing in too small an area, too many people drawing water from shrinking sources. The vegetation around the remaining water began to disappear, stripped away by desperate animals and humans trying to survive in an increasingly harsh environment. The people of the Green Sahara didn't simply disappear as their homeland dried. Many migrated, following the retreating waters northward to the Nile Valley or eastward toward the highlands of Ethiopia. Others adapted their lifestyles, becoming the nomadic peoples who learned to survive in the emerging desert. They developed new technologies, better water storage methods, drought-resistant crops, and the domestication of camels, which were better suited to desert conditions than cattle. As we let our minds rest in this ancient green Sahara, we can almost hear the gentle lapping of Lake Megachad against its shore, the distant trumpeting of elephants, and the soft rustle of grass in the evening breeze. It's a peaceful scene, this lost world, reminding us that even the harshest environments on our planet have stories of abundance and life hidden in their past. From the green heart of ancient Africa, let's allow our journey to carry us eastward across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. Today, this region contains some of the most extreme desert environments on Earth. The Rub al-Khali, or empty quarter, where summer temperatures can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit and rain might not fall for years at a time. But like the Sahara, Arabia too has a secret green past, hidden beneath its current cloak of sand and stone. During the same African humid period that transformed the Sahara, and in several earlier wet phases stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, the Arabian Peninsula was crossed by a network of rivers that would have rivaled those of modern-day Europe. These weren't the seasonal streams or wadis that occasionally carry water across the desert today, but permanent, flowing rivers with names that archaeologists have begun to piece together from ancient shoreline deposits and satellite imagery of buried riverbeds. Let's walk together along the banks of what scientists call the Kuwait River, though it existed tens of thousands of years before Kuwait as we know it. This ancient waterway flowed from the highlands of western Arabia all the way to the Persian Gulf, cutting a green swath across what is now empty desert. Along its banks, date palms and tamarisk trees created shaded corridors where early humans made their camps. The river itself was substantial, perhaps 50 feet wide in places, flowing year-round with water clear enough to see the bottom. Fish swam in its pools, and freshwater mussels filtered nutrients from its flow. Kingfishers dove from overhanging branches to catch small fish, while herons stood motionless in the shallows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. During the wet periods, this river was joined by numerous tributaries, creating a dendritic pattern of waterways that spread across the peninsula like the veins of a leaf. Each tributary supported its own ribbon of green vegetation, creating a network of oases connected by flowing water rather than isolated islands of life in a sea of sand. In what is now the heart of the empty quarter, there existed a series of large freshwater lakes. The largest of these, which geologists have named Lake Mundafan, covered an area of nearly 7 square miles, larger than any natural lake in the Middle East today. Picture yourself sitting beside this ancient lake on a warm evening, watching the sun set over water that stretches to the horizon. The lake is surrounded by extensive wetlands where cattails and sedges grow in thick stands. Waterfowl, ducks, geese, and wading birds move through these marshes in great numbers. The sound of their calls echoes across the water as day fades into night. Small boats made from bundled reeds carry fishermen across the lake's surface, their silhouettes dark against the reflected sky. Around the shores of these lakes and along the rivers, human settlements flourished in ways that seem almost impossible when we look at the same regions today. Archaeological evidence suggests that, during these wet periods, Arabia supported populations that were not just surviving, but thriving. They developed sophisticated tool technologies, created art, and established trade networks that stretched from Africa to Asia. The settlements around Lake Mundafan were particularly remarkable. Built on slightly elevated ground near the lake's shore, these communities consisted of permanent structures made from local stone and mud brick. The inhabitants had clearly planned to stay for generations, investing in wells, storage facilities, and workshop areas. Evidence suggests they engaged in specialized crafts, tool-making, pottery production, and textile weaving that indicates a complex economy based on more than simple subsistence. The vegetation in wet period Arabia was remarkably diverse. In the highland areas, where elevation provided cooler temperatures and more moisture, forests of juniper and wild olive trees covered the slopes. These weren't the sparse, drought-stressed trees we might see in Arabia's mountains today, but full forests with closed canopies and understories rich with ferns and flowering plants. In the river valleys, gallery forests created tunnels of green. Acacias, tamarisks, and dome palms grew in such profusion that their canopies often met overhead, creating cool, shaded pathways along the waterways. The understory in these areas was thick with shrubs and seasonal plants that bloomed spectacularly when the rains came. Even in the more open areas, away from rivers and lakes, the landscape was far from the barren desert of today. Grasslands covered vast areas, supporting herds of wild animals. Arabian oryx, gazelles, and wild asses moved across these plains in numbers that seem almost fantastical compared to the sparse wildlife populations of today's Arabia. The archaeological record from these wet periods reveals a sophisticated understanding of the environment and its resources. Ancient inhabitants of Arabia developed complex seasonal migration patterns, moving between different resource areas as conditions changed throughout the year. They created elaborate cache systems, storing food and tools at strategic locations across their territory. Some sites show evidence of astronomical observations, suggesting that these ancient peoples were tracking celestial cycles to predict seasonal changes and plan their activities accordingly. One of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Arabia's green periods was the presence of what scientists call fossil water, groundwater that was recharged during these wet periods and remains underground today. This water, trapped in aquifers deep beneath the desert, is still being discovered and tapped by modern drilling techniques. In some places, this fossil water is so close to the surface that it creates natural springs, small reminders of the abundant water that once flowed above ground. The climate that supported this green Arabia was driven by the same orbital cycles that brought moisture to the Sahara, but it was enhanced by Arabia's position between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Monsoon rains reached further west than they do today, while Mediterranean storm systems penetrated further south. The result was a climate that, while still marked by wet and dry seasons, was far more consistently humid than anything the region experiences today. The transformation from green Arabia to today's hyper-arid desert was a gradual process that paralleled the changes in the Sahara. As global climate patterns shifted with changing orbital cycles, the rain-bearing systems that had sustained the rivers and lakes began to weaken and retreat. The great rivers started to flow less reliably, their courses changing as their volume decreased. Eventually, most ceased to flow entirely, leaving only their buried channels as evidence of their former existence. The lakes began to shrink and became increasingly saline as evaporation exceeded inflow. Some persisted for centuries as brackish water bodies before finally drying completely, leaving behind salt deposits and fossilized remains of the life they once supported. Lake Mundafan may have been among the last to disappear, its deep basin holding water long after the rivers that fed it had ceased to flow. As we rest our minds in this ancient Arabia, we can imagine the gentle sound of water flowing over stones in a permanent stream, the splash of fish jumping in clear lakes, and the whisper of wind through reed beds. It's a landscape of abundance and life, a reminder that the harshest places on our planet have known gentler times. Our peaceful journey through time now carries us across the Indian Ocean to Australia, that ancient continent where some of the oldest rocks on Earth hold secrets of climates and landscapes that stretch back billions of years. Today, much of Australia's interior is occupied by various desert systems: the Great Victoria Desert, the Gibson Desert, the Great Sandy Desert, regions that receive less than 10 inches of rain per year and are home to some of the continent's most specialized desert plants and animals. But let's step back in time, not just thousands of years as we did with the Sahara and Arabia, but millions of years, to periods when Australia's climate was dramatically different from today. During various epochs, particularly during the Miocene period, roughly 15 to 20 million years ago, much of what is now desert in Australia was covered by lush, temperate forests and woodland savannas that would have seemed more at home in modern-day Tasmania or New Zealand. Imagine standing in what is now the heart of the Great Victoria Desert. But in this ancient time, you're surrounded by a forest of southern beech trees, their broad canopies creating a cathedral of green overhead. These weren't the small, twisted trees that struggle to survive in Australia's modern, arid interior, but tall, straight-trunked giants that could reach heights of over 100 feet. Their leaves rustled constantly in the moist air, creating a sound like gentle rain even on clear days. The understory of this ancient forest was rich and diverse. Tree ferns unfurled their fronds in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy, some reaching heights of 20 feet or more. Smaller ferns carpeted the forest floor, their delicate fronds creating intricate patterns of green. Moss covered fallen logs and rocks, retaining moisture and providing habitat for countless small creatures. Through this forest, permanent streams flowed year-round, cutting gentle valleys through the landscape. These weren't the seasonal creeks that briefly flow in today's desert after rare rainstorms, but substantial waterways that supported their own unique ecosystems. Along their banks, different species of trees grew, ancient relatives of the modern river red gums, but in much greater abundance and diversity. The climate that supported these forests was fundamentally different from anything Australia experiences today. Regular rainfall, distributed throughout the year, kept the soils moist and supported the complex web of life that characterizes temperate forests. The air was humid and often misty, especially in the mornings, when fog would drift between the tree trunks like ghostly veils. In the clearings and along the forest edges, grasslands and heathlands provided habitat for Australia's ancient fauna. During this period, the continent was home to creatures that seem almost mythological today. Giant wombats the size of small cars, marsupial lions with retractable claws, and enormous flightless birds that stood over 6 feet tall. These animals moved through a landscape of abundance, where food and water were plentiful and the climate was benign. The Diprotodon, Australia's largest marsupial ever, was particularly well adapted to this forested environment. Unlike the open country browsers that dominated later periods, these massive creatures, some weighing as much as a modern rhinoceros, fed on the tender shoots and leaves of forest trees. They moved through the ancient forests in small family groups, following well-worn paths between feeding areas and water sources. The plant life during this period was extraordinarily diverse. In addition to the dominant southern beech forests, there were areas of rainforest where vines hung like curtains between the trees and orchids bloomed in the canopy. Proteaceae, the family that includes modern banksias and grevilleas, were present, but in forms quite different from their drought-adapted descendants we see today. They had larger leaves and more delicate flowers, adapted to a world where water stress was not a constant concern. The ancient forests were not uniform, but varied with elevation, aspect, and local conditions. In the higher elevations, cooler temperatures supported different species. Ancient conifers related to modern kauri pines formed pure stands in some areas, their massive trunks creating open, park-like understories. In the warmer, lower elevations, mixed forests combined deciduous and evergreen species in complex mosaics that changed with the seasons. Even more remarkable were the wetland areas that existed in what is now desert. Large freshwater lakes, some covering hundreds of square miles, dotted the landscape. These lakes supported rich aquatic ecosystems, with fish, freshwater crayfish, and aquatic plants. Around their shores, extensive wetlands provided habitat for waterbirds and supported dense stands of reeds and rushes. Lake Bungunya was perhaps the largest of these ancient water bodies, covering much of what is now the Murray Basin. This massive lake system, fed by rivers that flowed year-round, supported a complex ecosystem of aquatic plants and animals. Fossil evidence suggests that early relatives of modern Murray cod grew to enormous sizes in these pristine waters, some specimens reaching lengths of over 6 feet. The shorelines of these ancient lakes were lined with gallery forests, different from those in the uplands. Here, swamp cypress and water gum trees created dense canopies that hung over the water's edge. The understory was thick with moisture-loving plants, giant sedges, water ferns, and climbing vines that formed impenetrable tangles in some areas. The human story in ancient Australia is complex and fascinating. While the continent's indigenous peoples arrived long after the great forests had begun their retreat, they encountered landscapes that were still far more mesic than today's arid interior. Early Aboriginal Australians developed sophisticated fire management techniques that helped maintain the transition zone between forest and grassland, creating the complex mosaic of habitats that characterized much of the continent when Europeans first arrived. The transformation from this green paradise to the desert we know today was a gradual process that unfolded over millions of years. As Australia drifted northward due to continental drift, it moved into drier latitudes. The gradual cooling and drying of the global climate also played a role, as did the development of the Antarctic ice sheet, which changed global weather patterns and reduced the amount of moisture that reached Australia's interior. But the transformation wasn't uniform or sudden. There were periods of retreat and advance, times when the forests expanded again, and times when they shrank back to refuge areas in the mountains and along the coasts. Some areas held on to their forest cover longer than others, creating islands of green in an increasingly arid landscape. The final stages of this transformation occurred during the Pleistocene ice ages, when changes in global sea level and weather patterns accelerated the drying of Australia's interior. The Great Lakes gradually shrank and became saline, eventually disappearing entirely or persisting only as salt lakes during brief wet periods. The forests retreated to the mountains and coastal areas where they still persist today, leaving behind only scattered remnants in the form of relict species and fossil deposits. Even today, remnants of this ancient green Australia can be found if you know where to look. In the Grampians of Victoria, in the forests of Tasmania, and in isolated mountain ranges throughout the continent, you can still find descendants of the plants that once covered much of what is now desert. These living fossils provide a window into Australia's green past and a reminder of the continent's capacity for supporting diverse ecosystems. As we let our minds rest in this ancient Australian forest, we can almost feel the soft humidity of the air, hear the drip of condensation from broad leaves, and sense the quiet rustle of small creatures moving through the understory. It's a peaceful scene, this lost world, where the harsh sun of today's interior was filtered through a canopy of green leaves, and the sound of flowing water was never far away. From Australia's ancient forests, our gentle journey through time carries us back to South Asia, to the region that now contains the Thar Desert, also known as the Great Indian Desert. This vast arid region, straddling the border between India and Pakistan, today receives most of its meager rainfall from the southwest monsoon, but even in good years, much of the Thar receives less than 4 inches of rain annually. Yet this desert too holds memories of much greener times, written in the sediments of dried lake beds and in the genetic memory of plants that seem almost impossibly well adapted to aridity. Let's travel back roughly 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, to a time when the monsoon rains that today barely reach the edges of the Thar penetrated deep into its heart. During this period, which coincides with the same orbital cycles that brought green times to the Sahara and Arabia, the Indian monsoon was significantly stronger and reached much further west than it does today. Picture yourself standing beside the Ghaggar-Hakra River, a waterway that today exists only as a dry channel that can be seen from satellite images, but which during this wet period was a mighty river comparable to the modern Ganges or Indus. The river flows year-round, fed not only by monsoon rains, but by glacial melt from the Himalayas, which during this period extended much further south than they do today. Along the banks of this ancient river, dense forests of sal and teak trees created corridors of green that stretched for hundreds of miles across what is now desert. These weren't the sparse, thorny forests that struggle to survive in the modern Thar, but lush, multi-layered forests with closed canopies and rich understories. The air beneath the canopy was cool and humid, filled with the calls of birds and the rustle of small mammals moving through the leaf litter. The river itself teemed with life. Large fish, catfish, massia, and river dolphins moved through its clear waters. Along its banks, mugger crocodiles basked in the dappled sunlight that filtered through overhanging branches, while fishing cats crept silently through the reeds, hunting for unwary fish and frogs. In the areas away from the main river, a network of smaller streams and seasonal rivers created an intricate web of water and vegetation. During the monsoon season, these waterways would swell and connect, creating a vast network of flowing water that supported abundant wildlife. Even during the dry season, many of these streams continued to flow, fed by groundwater that was constantly recharged by the annual rains. The vegetation in this ancient Thar was remarkably diverse. In the river valleys, dense forests gave way to more open woodlands as you moved away from the water. These woodlands were dominated by trees that are now found only in much more humid parts of India, species like mahua, whose fragrant flowers were gathered by early inhabitants, and banyan trees whose massive canopies provided shelter for entire communities of animals and humans. Between the woodlands, extensive grasslands supported herds of wild animals. Chital deer moved in large groups through the tall grass, while wild boar rooted in the soft, moist soil along stream banks. Nilgai antelope grazed in the more open areas, and even wild elephants moved through the landscape, following ancient migration routes between the forests of central India and the river valleys of what is now Pakistan. The grasslands themselves were remarkable ecosystems, dominated by tall bunch grasses that could reach heights of 6 feet or more during the growing season. These weren't the sparse, scattered clumps of grass that characterize the modern Thar, but continuous grasslands that stretched for miles, broken only by scattered groves of trees and seasonal water bodies. During the monsoon season, these grasslands would bloom with an extraordinary display of wildflowers. The timing was precise and predictable, different species flowering in succession as the rains progressed, creating waves of color that swept across the landscape. Local wildlife had evolved to take advantage of these predictable blooms, with different species timing their breeding and migration cycles to coincide with peak flowering periods. The human inhabitants of this green Thar were part of one of the world's earliest urban civilizations, the Indus Valley Civilization. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, located along the banks of the ancient Ghaggar-Hakra River and its tributaries, supported populations that may have numbered in the tens of thousands. These weren't struggling desert settlements, but sophisticated urban centers with advanced sanitation systems, planned streets, and evidence of long-distance trade networks. Archaeological evidence from these ancient cities reveals a society that was intimately connected to the river systems and seasonal patterns of their environment. Granaries stored surplus grain from the fertile river valleys, while workshops produced goods for trade across vast distances. The cities were clearly designed with the expectation of permanent settlement, with massive walls and infrastructure that suggested confidence in long-term environmental stability. The countryside around these urban centers was equally sophisticated. Archaeological surveys have revealed extensive networks of canals and irrigation systems that distributed the river water across broad agricultural areas. These weren't simple diversions, but complex engineering works that required detailed understanding of water flow, soil conditions, and seasonal patterns. The transformation of this green land into today's Thar Desert was closely linked to changes in the monsoon system. As the orbital cycles that had strengthened the monsoon began to shift, the rains started to fail more frequently and for longer periods. The great rivers began to change course, seeking new paths to the sea as their flow diminished. Eventually, many of them dried up entirely, leaving only their buried channels as evidence of their former existence. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system appears to have been particularly vulnerable to these changes. Unlike the Ganges and Indus, which are fed by permanent glacial sources in the high Himalayas, the Ghaggar-Hakra depended more heavily on monsoon rainfall and seasonal snowmelt from lower elevations. As the monsoon weakened and shifted eastward, this river system began to fail earlier and more completely than its neighbors. The effects on human civilization were dramatic. As the rivers became unreliable, the great cities of the Indus Valley Civilization began to decline. Archaeological evidence suggests that people initially adapted by developing new water management techniques and shifting to more drought-resistant crops. But eventually, many urban centers were abandoned as their water sources failed completely. The rural populations showed greater resilience, gradually adapting their lifestyles to the changing conditions. They developed new breeds of livestock, better suited to arid conditions, learned to exploit seasonal water sources, and created the nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures that have characterized the region for thousands of years. But the change wasn't just about less rain. The weakening of the monsoon also meant that the timing of the rains became more erratic. Instead of reliable annual floods that recharged groundwater and supported perennial vegetation, the region began to experience the kind of irregular, intense rainfall events that characterize it today. Brief, violent storms followed by long periods of drought. Even today, echoes of this greener past can be found throughout the Thar. Ancient lake beds, now covered by sand dunes, occasionally yield artifacts and fossils from the wetter period. Wells dug deep into the desert sometimes encounter layers of organic matter, the compressed remains of ancient forests and grasslands. And in the genetic makeup of the region's flora and fauna, scientists can read the signatures of adaptation to much more humid conditions. Some of the most remarkable evidence comes from the desert's scattered groves of kedri trees, which seem to remember the ancient river channels, even though the rivers themselves have been gone for thousands of years. These trees, sacred to local communities, often grow in lines that perfectly trace the courses of the buried rivers, their deep roots somehow still finding the ancient water sources far below the surface. As we rest our minds in this ancient Thar, we can imagine the sound of the Ghaggar-Hakra River flowing peacefully through forests of sal and teak, the calls of river dolphins echoing across the water, and the gentle patter of reliable monsoon rains on broad leaves. It's a landscape of abundance and predictability, where water was never scarce, and the green of living things stretched to every horizon. Our journey through time and space now carries us across the Pacific Ocean to North America, to a region that today is known as the Great Basin, a vast area of high desert that stretches across Nevada, Utah, and parts of California, Oregon, and Idaho. Today, this region is characterized by sparse sagebrush, alkali flats, and mountain ranges that rise like islands from a sea of arid plain. But during the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, this same landscape was dramatically different. A region of huge freshwater lakes, extensive wetlands, and forests that stretched far out into what is now empty desert. Let's begin our exploration beside the shore of Lake Lahontan, an ancient lake that at its largest extent covered over 8,000 square miles and reached depths of nearly 900 feet. Today, all that remains of this vast lake are a few small remnants: Pyramid Lake, Walker Lake, and the Carson Sink. But during the Ice Age, it was one of the largest freshwater bodies in North America. Standing beside this ancient lake on a clear morning, you would see water stretching to the horizon in every direction. The lake was so large that it generated its own weather patterns, moderating temperatures and increasing humidity throughout the basin. The air was often misty, especially in the early morning hours, when fog would roll off the water's surface and drift inland, providing moisture to vegetation far from the lake's shores. The lake itself was teeming with life. Ancient relatives of modern kui-wee fish, found today only in Pyramid Lake, swam in vast schools through the clear water. Freshwater shellfish carpeted the lake bottom, their shells eventually forming limestone deposits that can still be seen in the region's geology today. Waterfowl, ducks, geese, grebes, and pelicans gathered in numbers that would have darkened the sky during migration seasons. Around the lake's shores, extensive marshes and wetlands provided habitat for countless species. Tule elk, much larger than their modern descendants, grazed in the rich marsh grasses. Great blue herons and sandhill cranes stalked through the shallows, while beavers built elaborate dam systems in the streams that fed into the lake. The marshlands around Lake Lahontan were particularly rich and diverse. Vast stands of tule reeds created a maze of channels and openings that provided perfect habitat for waterfowl. These weren't sparse, scattered plants struggling to survive in marginal conditions, but dense, healthy stands that could stretch for miles along the lake's shore. The rustling of these reeds in the wind created a constant, soothing whisper that could be heard for miles across the water. But Lake Lahontan was not alone. Throughout the Great Basin, numerous other large lakes dotted the landscape. Lake Bonneville, centered in what is now Utah, was even larger than Lahontan, covering an area roughly the size of Lake Superior. At its peak, this lake was over 1,000 feet deep and supported its own complex ecosystem of fish, birds, and aquatic plants. The fish populations in these ancient lakes were remarkable for their size and diversity. Bonneville cisco, now found only in Bear Lake, once swam in vast schools throughout the lake system. Ancient relatives of modern cutthroat trout grew to enormous sizes in these pristine waters, some specimens reaching lengths that seem almost impossible by today's standards. The abundance of fish supported not only large populations of fish-eating birds, but also provided a crucial protein source for early human inhabitants. The climate that supported these vast lakes was fundamentally different from today's arid conditions. During the Ice Age, storm systems from the Pacific Ocean carried much more moisture into the interior of the continent. The jet stream, displaced southward by the continental ice sheets, brought regular precipitation to the Great Basin throughout much of the year. Snow accumulated in the surrounding mountains to depths of many feet, and spring melts sent torrents of fresh water cascading into the basin's lakes and streams. The seasonal cycle in this ancient Great Basin was dramatically different from today. Instead of the extreme aridity that characterizes the modern region, there was a predictable annual cycle of wet and dry seasons. The wet season, fed by Pacific storms, would fill the lakes and streams and support lush growth of vegetation throughout the basin. Even the dry season maintained sufficient moisture to support permanent vegetation and keep the lakes from dropping significantly. In the higher elevations surrounding these ancient lakes, forests extended far below their current tree lines. Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and limber pine grew at elevations where today you might find only sagebrush and scattered juniper. These forests were not just individual trees clinging to existence, but continuous woodland that provided habitat for Ice Age mammals, giant ground sloths, American cheetahs, and massive bison that were nearly twice the size of modern buffalo. The forest ecosystems around these mountain ranges were complex and diverse. At the highest elevations, where snow persisted well into summer, alpine meadows bloomed with spectacular wildflower displays during the brief growing season. Lower down, dense coniferous forests created cool, shaded understories where moisture-loving plants thrived. Bears, elk, and mountain sheep moved through these forests, following seasonal patterns that had remained unchanged for millennia. Even in the lower elevations, around the lakes and in the valley bottoms, the vegetation was far more diverse and abundant than today. Instead of the sparse sagebrush steppe that characterizes much of the modern Great Basin, there were extensive grasslands interspersed with groves of cottonwoods and aspens. Spring wildflower displays would have been spectacular, with vast areas carpeted in lupine, paintbrush, and other flowering plants. The grasslands that surrounded the ancient lakes were particularly remarkable. These weren't the sparse, scattered bunch grasses that survive in today's arid environment, but continuous prairies that could stretch for dozens of miles. During the growing season, these grasses could reach heights of 4 feet or more, creating a sea of green that undulated in the wind like ocean waves. These grasslands supported herds of large mammals that seem almost mythical by today's standards. Columbian mammoths, standing over 12 feet tall, moved across the landscape in family groups, following ancient migration routes between seasonal feeding areas. Giant bison, nearly twice the size of modern buffalo, grazed in herds that could number in the thousands. Camels, yes, North American camels, browsed on shrubs and trees throughout the region. The predators that hunted these great herds were equally impressive. American lions, larger than modern African lions, stalked their prey through the tall grass. Dire wolves, with jaws powerful enough to crack mammoth bones, hunted in coordinated packs. Short-faced bears, standing over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, were omnivorous giants that could run down prey despite their massive size. The transformation from this lake-filled landscape to today's high desert was a gradual process that began as the last ice age ended. As global temperatures warmed, the storm tracks that had brought moisture to the Great Basin shifted northward. The Great Lakes began to shrink, their water levels dropping year by year as evaporation exceeded inflow. This wasn't just a simple drying process, but a complex interplay of climate, geology, and hydrology. As the lakes shrank, they became increasingly saline, eventually reaching salt concentrations that could support only specialized organisms. Some lakes disappeared entirely, leaving behind only alkali flats and salt deposits. Others persisted as much smaller, often saline remnants of their former selves. The shrinking of the lakes had cascading effects on the entire ecosystem. Without the moderating influence of large bodies of water, temperatures became more extreme, hotter in summer, colder in winter. The loss of lake effect precipitation meant that vegetation had to adapt to much drier conditions, or retreat to higher elevations and north-facing slopes where moisture was still available. The great herds of Ice Age mammals couldn't adapt quickly enough to these changing conditions. As the grasslands dried and fragmented, their food sources became scattered and unreliable. Competition for remaining resources intensified, and many species simply couldn't maintain viable populations in the transformed landscape. The arrival of human hunters may have accelerated the process, but the fundamental cause was the loss of the rich, stable ecosystems that had supported them for millennia. Human populations in the region were deeply affected by these changes as well. Archaeological evidence suggests that Native American groups developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for dealing with the drying environment. They learned to exploit smaller and more ephemeral water sources, developed complex seasonal migration patterns, and created elaborate trade networks to share resources across the changing landscape. The Paiute and Shoshone peoples who inhabited the Great Basin in historic times were the inheritors of thousands of years of adaptation to increasingly arid conditions. Their cultures reflected deep knowledge of desert survival. They knew how to find water in seemingly waterless landscapes, how to process dozens of different plant species for food, and how to time their movements to take advantage of scattered and seasonal resources. Even today, evidence of the Great Basin's wetter past is visible throughout the region. Ancient shorelines, carved into mountainsides hundreds of feet above current valley floors, mark the high water levels of the Pleistocene lakes. In places like the Ruby Mountains of Nevada or the Wasatch Range in Utah, you can still see the wave-cut terraces and beach deposits left by lakes that disappeared thousands of years ago. Fossil deposits from this period reveal the incredible diversity of life that once flourished here. Giant beaver dams, preserved in ancient lake sediments, show the engineering prowess of these Ice Age rodents. Pollen samples from lake cores reveal the complex mosaic of vegetation types that once covered the region. Even the chemistry of the ancient lake waters can be reconstructed from mineral deposits, providing detailed pictures of past climate conditions. As we let our minds rest beside the shores of ancient Lake Lahontan, we can imagine the gentle lapping of waves against a reed-lined shore, the calls of countless waterfowl echoing across miles of open water, and the sight of snow-capped mountains reflected in the lake's clear surface. It's a landscape of abundance and beauty, where water was the dominant element, and life flourished in forms that seem almost impossible when viewed from today's arid perspective. From the ancient lakes of North America, our peaceful journey carries us across the Pacific to one of Asia's most famous deserts, the Gobi. Today, this vast expanse stretching across Mongolia and northern China is known for its extreme temperatures, fierce winds, and sparse vegetation. It's a place where winter temperatures can plummet to 40 degrees Fahrenheit and summer heat can soar above 120 degrees, where sandstorms can last for days and annual rainfall measures in single digits of inches. But let's travel back in time to the Eocene epoch, roughly 40 to 50 million years ago, when this same region enjoyed a subtropical climate and was covered by lush forests that would seem more at home in modern-day Southeast Asia than in the heart of continental Asia. During this period, the Gobi region was positioned further south due to continental drift, and global climate patterns were dramatically warmer and more humid than today. Imagine yourself walking through a forest in what is now the heart of the Gobi Desert. But in this ancient time, you're surrounded by towering trees that rise like pillars into a canopy so dense it filters the sunlight into a gentle green glow. These aren't the hardy, drought-adapted trees you might find scattered across today's desert margins, but magnificent broadleaf trees with trunks several feet in diameter and canopies that stretch wide to capture the abundant moisture in the air. The forest floor beneath your feet is soft with decades of accumulated leaf litter. Ferns unfurl their fronds in the humid air, some growing to tree-like proportions in the consistent warmth and moisture. Vines hang like curtains between the tree trunks, some bearing flowers that perfume the air with sweet fragrances that seem almost tropical in their intensity. Through this forest, numerous streams and rivers flowed year-round, cutting gentle valleys through the landscape. These waterways were clear and clean, supporting fish populations and providing corridors for different types of vegetation. Along their banks, different species of trees grew. Ancient relatives of modern Asian trees, but in forms adapted to the consistently warm, humid climate of this prehistoric world. The air in this ancient Gobi forest was thick with humidity and alive with sound. The calls of early birds, some species that would seem familiar today, others that were unique to this warmer world, echoed through the canopy. Insects buzzed among the flowers, and small mammals rustled through the understory vegetation. It was a world of abundance, where the struggle for water that defines today's Gobi was simply unknown. During this period, the region that is now the Gobi was home to an extraordinary diversity of plant and animal life. Fossil evidence from sites throughout Asia gives us clues about what this lost world might have looked like. There were early relatives of modern horses, but much smaller and adapted to forest life rather than open plains. Ancient primates swung through the trees, while early relatives of modern carnivores hunted on the forest floor. The plant life was particularly diverse. In addition to the dominant broadleaf forests, there were areas of more open woodland where different types of trees created a mosaic of habitats. Palm trees grew in some areas, their fronds rustling in the warm, humid air. Flowering trees bloomed throughout much of the year, supported by a climate that was not only warm and wet, but remarkably stable compared to the extreme seasonal variations that characterize the modern Gobi. One of the most remarkable aspects of this ancient forest was its sheer extent. This wasn't just a small pocket of green in an otherwise arid landscape, but a continuous forest ecosystem that stretched for hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles. The forest connected with similar ecosystems across much of Asia and Europe, creating corridors for the movement of plants and animals across vast distances. The understory of these ancient Gobi forests was particularly rich and complex. Multiple layers of vegetation created diverse microhabitats, each supporting its own complement of specialized species. Ground-level herbs and mosses thrived in the dim, humid conditions beneath the canopy. Shrubs and small trees formed an intermediate layer, while epiphytes, plants that grew on other plants, created aerial gardens in the forest canopy. The seasonal patterns in this ancient forest were gentle compared to today's extreme variations. Instead of the brutal winters and scorching summers that characterize the modern Gobi, there was a mild seasonal cycle with warm summers and cool but frost-free winters. Rainfall was distributed throughout the year, ensuring that plants never experienced the severe drought stress that shapes vegetation in the current desert. The animal communities in these forests were complex and interconnected. Large browsers, early relatives of modern deer and antelope, fed on the abundant foliage. Omnivorous mammals exploited both plant and animal resources, while specialized predators hunted specific prey species. The forest supported multiple levels of predation, from small insectivores to large carnivores, creating food webs of remarkable complexity. The climate that supported these forests was driven by global patterns very different from today. During the Eocene, there were no permanent ice caps at either pole, which meant that global temperatures were much more even from equator to pole. Ocean currents flowed in different patterns, and the positioning of the continents created wind and precipitation patterns that brought abundant moisture to interior regions that today are among the world's most arid. The greenhouse conditions of the Eocene were maintained by atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that were several times higher than today. This enhanced greenhouse effect not only kept global temperatures warm, but also intensified the water cycle, bringing more evaporation from the oceans and more precipitation to continental interiors. The transformation from this forest paradise to today's desert was a process that unfolded over millions of years. As the global climate gradually cooled and dried, as India collided with Asia to create the Himalayas, and as the continents slowly moved to their current positions, the climate patterns that had supported the Gobi's forests began to break down. The rise of the Tibetan Plateau was particularly important in this transformation. As the plateau rose, it began to block moisture-bearing air masses from reaching the interior of Asia, creating a rain shadow effect that gradually dried out the region. The formation of the Himalayas also changed global wind patterns, redirecting the jet stream and altering the paths of storm systems that had previously brought regular precipitation to the area. The cooling of global climate also played a crucial role. As carbon dioxide levels dropped and ice caps began to form at the poles, the enhanced greenhouse effect that had maintained Eocene warmth gradually weakened. The temperature gradients between equator and pole became steeper, changing atmospheric circulation patterns and reducing the amount of moisture that reached continental interiors. The transition wasn't uniform or sudden. There were periods when forest conditions persisted in some areas while desert conditions developed in others. River valleys and areas of higher elevation retained forest cover longer than exposed uplands. Some plant and animal species were able to adapt to the changing conditions, while others became extinct or retreated to more favorable environments. Even today, traces of this ancient green Gobi can be found by those who know how to look. Fossilized wood from ancient trees occasionally surfaces in the desert, preserved in the dry conditions that followed the forest's disappearance. Paleontologists working in the Gobi regularly discover fossils of animals and plants that speak to the region's much more humid past. Perhaps most remarkably, some plant species that survived the transition from forest to desert carry genetic markers that suggest their ancestors lived in much more humid conditions. These living fossils, adapted to today's harsh conditions but carrying the genetic memory of a greener past, provide a direct link between the Gobi's forest history and its desert present. The transformation of the Gobi also had profound effects on global climate systems. The loss of this vast forest meant the loss of a major carbon sink and a significant source of atmospheric moisture. The replacement of forest with desert changed regional albedo, the reflectivity of the surface, which in turn affected local and regional temperature patterns. As we rest our minds in this ancient Gobi forest, we can almost feel the humid warmth of the air, hear the gentle drip of condensation from broad leaves, and sense the quiet rustle of small creatures moving through the thick understory. It's a peaceful scene, this lost world, where the harsh winds and extreme temperatures of today's desert were unknown, and the sound of flowing water and rustling leaves created a constant, soothing symphony. Our gentle journey through time now carries us to South America, to what is today the Atacama Desert of Chile, often called the driest place on Earth. Some weather stations in the Atacama have never recorded rainfall, and parts of this desert receive less than 1 millimeter of precipitation per year. It's a landscape so harsh and alien that NASA uses it to test equipment bound for Mars. Yet even this most extreme of deserts has known periods of relative abundance, times when its now barren valleys supported lakes, wetlands, and vegetation. Let's travel back roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum, when cooler global temperatures and different atmospheric circulation patterns brought significantly more moisture to this region of South America. During this period, what is now the heart of the Atacama was dotted with freshwater lakes and surrounded by vegetation that, while never lush by tropical standards, was abundant compared to the near-total barrenness of today. Picture yourself standing beside the shore of one of these ancient lakes, perhaps in what is now the Salar de Atacama, the largest salt flat in Chile. But in this ancient time, instead of a blindingly white expanse of salt crystals, you're looking out over a body of fresh water that stretches for miles, its surface reflecting the snow-capped peaks of the Andes that rise dramatically to the east. The lake is fed by streams that flow down from the mountains, carrying snowmelt and groundwater from higher elevations. These aren't the seasonal trickles that occasionally appear in the Atacama today after rare rainfall events, but permanent waterways that support ribbons of green vegetation along their banks. Grasses and sedges grow in thick stands where the streams enter the lake, providing habitat for waterfowl and small mammals. The air around this ancient lake carries a different quality than the bone-dry atmosphere of today's Atacama. While still arid by most standards, there's enough humidity to support plant life beyond the immediate vicinity of water sources. Hardy shrubs and grasses dot the landscape, their deep roots tapping into groundwater that was much closer to the surface during this wetter period. During this time, the Atacama supported what scientists call a pluvial fauna, animals adapted to these cooler, slightly wetter conditions. Vicuñas, the wild relatives of llamas and alpacas, grazed on the sparse but widespread vegetation. Their herds moved across the high plateaus, following seasonal patterns of plant growth, traveling between different lake systems as conditions changed throughout the year. The lakes themselves supported surprisingly diverse aquatic ecosystems. Flamingos fed in the shallow waters, filtering algae and small crustaceans from the nutrient-rich water. These weren't just occasional visitors, as modern flamingos are to the few remaining water sources in the Atacama, but year-round residents supported by stable lake ecosystems. 3 species of flamingos inhabited these ancient lakes: Chilean, Andean, and James's flamingos, each occupying slightly different ecological niches. The Chilean flamingos preferred the deeper, more open waters, while Andean flamingos fed in shallow areas rich in diatoms. James's flamingos specialized in filtering the smallest food particles from highly alkaline waters. Together, they created a spectacular display of pink and white that could be seen from miles away. Archaeological evidence suggests that human populations also found ways to thrive in this less harsh version of the Atacama. Early inhabitants developed sophisticated strategies for exploiting the scattered water sources and seasonal vegetation. They created elaborate networks of trails connecting different lake systems and resource areas, some of which can still be traced across the desert today. The Chinchorro people, who inhabited the coastal areas of the Atacama during this period, developed one of the world's earliest mummification traditions. The dry conditions that preserved their mummies also preserved detailed records of their diet and lifestyle. Analysis of these remains shows that they exploited both marine and terrestrial resources, moving seasonally between the coast and inland lake systems. One of the most remarkable aspects of this wetter Atacama was the presence of what geologists call paleolakes, not just single bodies of water, but interconnected systems of lakes and wetlands that created corridors of life across what is now empty desert. During particularly wet periods, some of these lake systems may have been connected by flowing streams, creating a network of aquatic habitats that supported the movement of fish, birds, and other water-dependent species. The largest of these ancient lake systems was centered in what is now the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia and extended south into Chile. At its maximum extent, this lake covered over 23,000 square miles, larger than Lake Erie. The lake was deep enough to support fish populations and complex enough to develop different habitats in its various bays and inlets. The vegetation around these ancient lakes was dominated by plants that are now found only at much higher elevations or in more southern latitudes. Cushion plants, dense rounded shrubs that conserve moisture and heat, covered large areas of the high plains. These plant communities, while sparse by most standards, were rich enough to support grazing animals and the predators that followed them. Tola shrubs, now found only in scattered populations, formed extensive communities around the lake margins. These evergreen shrubs, with their small, waxy leaves adapted to conserve moisture, created a low but continuous canopy that provided habitat for small mammals and birds. During the brief flowering season, these communities would bloom in waves of yellow and white flowers that attracted insects and seed-eating birds. The high plains around the lakes supported grasslands, dominated by bunch grasses that are now restricted to small, isolated populations in the wettest areas of the modern Atacama. These grasses formed the base of a food web that supported herds of vicuñas, their predators, and scavengers. The grasslands also provided nesting habitat for ground-dwelling birds and small mammals. The transformation from this relatively wet Atacama to today's hyper-arid desert was driven by the same global climate changes that affected deserts worldwide as the last ice age ended. But the Atacama's transformation was particularly extreme because of its unique geographic position. Trapped between the cold Humboldt Current of the Pacific Ocean and the towering wall of the Andes Mountains, the region became increasingly isolated from moisture sources as climate patterns shifted. As temperatures warmed, the storm tracks that had brought occasional precipitation to the Atacama shifted further south. The already limited rainfall became even more sporadic and unreliable. The ancient lakes began to shrink and become increasingly saline as evaporation exceeded inflow. Eventually, most disappeared entirely, leaving behind only salt flats and the occasional underground aquifer as evidence of their former existence. The speed and extent of this transformation was remarkable. Within just a few thousand years, a landscape that had supported lakes, wetlands, and diverse plant and animal communities became one of the most barren places on Earth. The process was so thorough that in some areas, soils that formed during the wetter period are still preserved beneath the surface, virtually unchanged after thousands of years of extreme aridity. The final stages of this transformation created some of the most extreme desert conditions on Earth. The combination of the cold Humboldt Current, which suppresses evaporation and cloud formation along the coast, and the rain shadow effect of the Andes Mountains, which blocks moisture from the Amazon basin, created a double barrier to precipitation. Some areas of the Atacama may not have received measurable rainfall for centuries. Today, remnants of the Atacama's wetter past can still be found by those who know where to look. Ancient shorelines, carved into the sides of mountains and hills, mark the high water levels of the vanished lakes. Deposits of diatomaceous earth, the fossilized remains of microscopic algae, provide evidence of the rich aquatic ecosystems that once thrived here. Perhaps most remarkably, some of the deepest parts of the ancient lake systems still hold water, though it's now highly saline and lies far beneath the surface. These underground brines, trapped in pockets of rock and sediment, are sometimes accessed by deep drilling and provide a direct chemical link to the Atacama's wetter past. The minerals dissolved in these ancient brines tell the story of the lake's final years. As the waters became increasingly concentrated through evaporation, different minerals precipitated out in sequence, creating layered deposits that preserve a detailed record of the drying process. These natural archives allow scientists to reconstruct not only the timeline of the transformation, but also the chemical conditions that existed during the transition. As we let our minds rest beside the shores of this ancient Atacama lake, we can imagine the gentle lapping of fresh water against a rocky shore, the distant calls of flamingos feeding in shallow bays, and the sight of vicuñas moving in long lines across grasslands that stretched between scattered lakes. It's a landscape of subtle beauty and surprising abundance, where life found ways to flourish even in one of the world's most challenging environments. From the transformed lakes of the ancient Atacama, our journey through time brings us to a broader understanding of the forces that have shaped these desert transformations. As we've traveled together through these lost green worlds, a pattern has emerged, one of great cycles that operate on time scales far longer than human lifetimes, yet which have profoundly shaped the world that humans have inherited and learned to call home. The transformations we've witnessed aren't random or chaotic, but follow predictable patterns driven by forces as regular as clockwork, yet operating on scales so vast they seem almost incomprehensible from our human perspective. These are the Milankovitch cycles, changes in Earth's orbit around the Sun that occur over periods of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. Let's take a moment to understand these great clockworks of climate. Earth's orbit around the Sun isn't perfectly circular or constant. Over periods of about 100,000 years, our planet's orbit stretches from more circular to more elliptical and back again. Over 41,000-year cycles, the tilt of Earth's axis changes, affecting how much sunlight reaches different latitudes during different seasons. And over periods of about 26,000 years, Earth wobbles on its axis like a spinning top, changing which seasons occur when Earth is closest to or furthest from the Sun. These might seem like subtle changes, but their effects on climate are profound. When these cycles align in particular ways, they can strengthen or weaken the monsoon systems that bring life-giving rain to vast areas of Africa and Asia. They can determine whether storm systems penetrate deep into continental interiors or remain confined to coastal regions. They can influence ocean currents, atmospheric circulation patterns, and the growth or retreat of ice sheets. It was the alignment of these orbital cycles that brought the green times we've explored together. About 10,000 years ago, during what scientists call the Holocene climate optimum, the cycles aligned to bring increased solar radiation to the northern hemisphere during summer months. This strengthened the African and Asian monsoons, bringing abundant rainfall to regions that are now among the world's most arid deserts. The orbital configuration during this period was particularly favorable for moisture transport to continental interiors. The increased summer radiation in the northern hemisphere strengthened the thermal contrast between land and ocean, intensifying monsoon circulation. At the same time, the position of Earth's orbit meant that northern hemisphere summers occurred when Earth was closest to the Sun, further amplifying the heating that drives monsoon systems. But these same cycles that brought abundance also, inevitably, brought its end. As the orbital patterns shifted, the monsoons weakened, storm tracks changed, and the great green periods gradually came to a close. The transformation wasn't sudden, it unfolded over centuries and millennia, but it was ultimately inexorable, driven by the same celestial mechanics that had created the green periods in the first place. What makes these transformations particularly poignant is that humans were there to witness them. Our species evolved during a period of dramatic climate change, and our earliest civilizations developed during the transition from the green Sahara to the desert we know today. The rock art left behind in what is now the heart of the Sahara tells the story of this transformation in images. Early paintings show people swimming and fishing in abundant waters. Later ones depict herding in grasslands, and the most recent show the desert adaptations that continue to this day. The Tassili Nadja region of Algeria contains some of the most spectacular examples of this artistic record. The oldest paintings, dating from the wet period, show scenes of abundance. People diving into deep pools, boats navigating large rivers, and abundant wildlife including hippos, crocodiles, and fish. Later paintings show the gradual adaptation to drier conditions. Cattle herding becomes more prominent, and the depicted landscapes become increasingly arid. The collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, one of the world's earliest urban cultures, appears to have been closely linked to the drying of the Ghaggar-Hakra river system as the monsoons weakened. Archaeological evidence suggests that as the rivers failed, people adapted by developing new technologies and social systems, but also by gradually abandoning the great cities and dispersing into smaller, more mobile communities. The transformation wasn't just environmental, but social and cultural as well. As reliable water sources became scarce, communities had to develop new forms of organization that could function across larger territories and with more mobile populations. Trade networks became more important as local resources became less reliable. Social hierarchies may have become more flexible as communities needed to respond quickly to changing environmental conditions. In North America, Native American oral traditions preserve memories of the Great Lakes that once filled the basins of Nevada and Utah. Stories passed down through generations speak of times when water covered the land, when different animals lived in the region, and when the seasonal patterns of resources were fundamentally different from those known in historic times. The Paiute people of the Great Basin have oral traditions that describe a time when their ancestors lived beside great waters and hunted animals that no longer exist. These stories, passed down through countless generations, preserve memories of the Ice Age lakes and megafauna that once characterized the region. Modern archaeological and paleontological research has confirmed many details preserved in these ancient stories. These human witnesses to environmental transformation have left us more than just archaeological remains and oral traditions. They've left us examples of remarkable adaptability and resilience. As the environments around them changed, human communities developed new technologies, social systems, and cultural practices that allowed them to thrive in increasingly challenging conditions. The peoples of the drying Sahara became master nomads, developing breeds of cattle and camels that could survive on minimal water and learning to read the subtle signs of desert weather and vegetation. They created trade networks that spanned the continent and social systems that could function across vast distances and in environments where resources were scattered and unpredictable. The Tuareg people of the modern Sahara are inheritors of this ancient knowledge. Their traditional navigation techniques allow them to cross seemingly featureless desert by reading subtle signs in sand patterns, star positions, and wind directions. Their social organization, with its emphasis on mobility and reciprocity, reflects thousands of years of adaptation to a harsh and unpredictable environment. In the Great Basin of North America, as the Great Lakes disappeared, indigenous peoples developed incredibly sophisticated ecological knowledge. They learned to exploit dozens of different plant and animal species to predict the movements of game animals and to locate water sources that were invisible to the untrained eye. They created seasonal round systems that maximized the use of scattered resources and developed technologies for processing foods that allowed them to extract nutrition from plants that seemed almost inedible. The complexity of Great Basin indigenous knowledge systems is remarkable. A single individual might know the locations of hundreds of different resource sites across thousands of square miles, the seasonal timing of dozens of different food sources, and the processing techniques required to make poisonous plants edible. This knowledge was accumulated over thousands of years of adaptation to increasingly arid conditions. Even today, as we face our own period of rapid environmental change, there's much to learn from these ancient examples of adaptation and resilience. The peoples who witnessed the Great Drying didn't simply suffer through it, they innovated, adapted, and in many cases thrived in their transformed environments. Perhaps most importantly, they maintained their connection to the land even as it changed around them. They developed new cultural practices and spiritual beliefs that acknowledged the fundamental reality of environmental change, while still maintaining deep relationships with the places they called home. Their stories remind us that change itself is the only constant, and that human communities can find ways to flourish, even as the world transforms around them. The lesson from these ancient transformations isn't that change is something to be feared, but that it's something to be understood and adapted to. The orbital cycles that drove the great climate changes of the past continue to operate today, and understanding them helps us place current changes in context. While human activities are now the dominant driver of environmental change, the longer perspective provided by these ancient transformations reminds us of both the fragility and the resilience of natural systems. As we rest our minds with these ancient witnesses to transformation, we can imagine the conversations around campfires as elders shared memories of wetter times with younger generations who knew only the drying world. We can picture the gradual development of new skills and knowledge as communities learned to thrive in changing environments. It's a story of human adaptability and resilience, of our species' remarkable ability to find ways to flourish, even as the world transforms around us. And so, dear listeners, our gentle journey through the green ghosts of desert lands draws to a peaceful close. We've wandered together through time and space, visiting landscapes that seem almost impossible when viewed from our present moment. The Sahara filled with lakes and rivers, Arabia crossed by flowing waterways, Australia's heart clothed in temperate forests, the Gobi supporting subtropical jungles, and even the harsh Atacama dotted with freshwater lakes. These aren't just stories of environmental change, but reminders of something profound about our planet and our place upon it. They tell us that the world we know today, the one that seems so permanent and fixed, is actually just one moment in an endless dance of transformation that has been going on for billions of years and will continue long after we're gone. There's something deeply comforting in this perspective, isn't there? In a world that often feels uncertain and chaotic, there's peace to be found in understanding that change itself is the only constant, that our planet has always been in motion, always becoming something new. The green worlds we've visited tonight weren't paradise lost, but simply different chapters in Earth's ongoing story. And what remarkable chapters they were. We've seen hippos swimming in the heart of what is now the Sahara, elephants walking through forests where today only sand dunes rise, and flamingos feeding in lakes that have since become salt flats in the world's driest desert. We've witnessed the extraordinary creativity of life itself, its ability to fill every available niche, to flourish wherever conditions allow, and to adapt as those conditions change. Perhaps most importantly, we've seen how our own species has been part of this great story of transformation. Humans weren't just passive witnesses to these changes, but active participants who learned, adapted, and found ways to thrive even as the world transformed around them. In their stories of resilience and adaptation, we find hope for our own ability to navigate the changes that lie ahead. The rock artists of the ancient Sahara left us images that span millennia, showing the gradual transformation from abundance to aridity. The oral traditions of Great Basin peoples preserved memories of ancient lakes through countless generations. The sophisticated water management systems of the Indus Valley civilization show us what's possible when human ingenuity meets environmental challenge. These aren't just archaeological curiosities, but lessons in how communities can maintain their identity and purpose, even as everything around them changes. As we've journeyed together through these lost worlds, we've also traveled through the great cycles that shape our planet's climate. The orbital clockworks that brought green times to the deserts continue their eternal dance, following laws as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Understanding these cycles doesn't diminish their wonder, but rather deepens our appreciation for the intricate mechanisms that govern our world. The transformation we've witnessed tonight remind us that desert and forest, abundance and scarcity, wet and dry. These aren't permanent states, but temporary arrangements, moments in a constantly shifting pattern of climate and life. The Sahara will be green again someday. Rivers will flow once more across Arabia, and forests may yet return to Australia's heart. Different species will inhabit these renewed landscapes, different forms of life will flourish, but the fundamental story will continue. The story of a planet that is always changing, always becoming, always creating new possibilities for life to unfold. In our own time, as we witness rapid environmental changes, the stories of these ancient transformations offer both perspective and hope. They remind us that dramatic environmental change is not unprecedented in Earth's history, and that life, including human life, has repeatedly found ways to adapt and flourish in transformed conditions. They also remind us of the deep connections between human communities and the environments that sustain them, and the importance of maintaining those connections even as conditions change. The peoples who witnessed the drying of the Sahara didn't simply despair as their green world disappeared. They innovated, adapted, and created new ways of living that were appropriate to their changing environment. They developed technologies and social systems that could function in arid conditions. They preserved essential knowledge through oral traditions and cultural practices, and they maintained their sense of identity and community, even as they adapted to new realities. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, let your mind drift back to these green ghost lands. Imagine the sound of water flowing, where now there is only silence, the rustle of leaves, where now there is only wind through sand. Picture the abundance of life that once flourished in the world's most unlikely places, and remember that beneath even the harshest desert sands lie the seeds of transformation, waiting for their season to return. For these great cycles continue still. The orbital clockworks that brought green times to the deserts continue their eternal dance, and someday, perhaps in tens of thousands of years, the rains will return to the Sahara, rivers will flow again across Arabia, and forests will once more clothe the heart of Australia. Different species will inhabit these renewed landscapes, different forms of life will flourish, but the fundamental story will continue. The story of a planet that is always changing, always becoming, always creating new possibilities for life to unfold. The ancient lake beds of the Great Basin still hold water deep underground, waiting. The buried river channels of Arabia preserve their courses beneath the sand, ready to carry water again when the rains return. The genetic memory of Australia's desert plants carries instructions for thriving in wetter times. The transformation may take millennia, but it is as certain as the orbital mechanics that drive it. In this great turning of the cosmic wheel, we find both humility and hope. Humility, because it reminds us that the landscapes we know are temporary, that the conditions we consider normal are just brief moments in much longer cycles. Hope, because it shows us that change brings not just endings, but beginnings, not just loss, but renewal, not just challenges, but opportunities for life to express itself in new and wonderful ways. The human story is part of this larger narrative. We are not separate from these great cycles of change, but participants in them. Our ancestors witnessed the transformation of green Saharas into deserts and learned to thrive in both. They saw great lakes disappear and found new ways to find and conserve water. They watched forests retreat and learned to live in open country. Their adaptability and resilience are part of our inheritance, written into our cultures, our technologies, and our very genes. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let the peace of deep time wash over you. Rest in the knowledge that you are part of an ancient story that stretches back billions of years and forward into an unimaginable future. The same forces that created the green Sahara and filled the Great Basin with lakes are still at work, still shaping our world, still creating new chapters in the endless story of Earth's transformation. Let the gentle rhythm of change be your lullaby tonight. Like waves upon a shore, like seasons in their turning, like the slow dance of continents and the patient work of rivers carving canyons, change comes in its own time, following rhythms deeper than human worry or desire. In those rhythms, there is wisdom, and in that wisdom, there is peace. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this great story, a conscious moment in the long dream of Earth. Let the green ghosts of ancient deserts whisper their quiet songs of transformation and renewal. In the morning, you'll wake to a world that is subtly different from the one you knew yesterday, for change never stops, and in that constant becoming lies all the wonder and possibility in the world. Dream tonight of ancient rivers flowing through green Saharas, of flamingos feeding in lakes that stretched to the horizon, of forests rustling in places where now only wind moves through emptiness. Dream of the patient work of time, of the great cycles that connect all things, of the endless creativity of life finding ways to flourish wherever conditions allow. And in your dreams, remember that every ending is also a beginning. Every drought precedes a rain. Every winter gives way to spring. The green times will come again, in forms we cannot imagine, bringing life to places we now think barren, creating abundance where now there seems only scarcity. This is the promise of the great cycles, the hope held in the turning of the world. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may your sleep be filled with the gentle sound of ancient waters and the rustle of leaves in forests that once grew where now only dreams remain. May you wake refreshed by the knowledge that change itself is the source of all beauty, all life, all possibility. And may you carry with you always the peace that comes from understanding your place in the great, ongoing story of our ever-changing, ever-beautiful world. Rest now, and let the greenery sing you to sleep.